I'll be talking today about my past research as well as my future research agenda under this title. But I'll start with a confession. That is that for the better part of the last decade, I've been slightly obsessed with coffee. And not just as something that I drink a lot in order to stay productive, although my colleagues will also know that that is very true, but as a product that underpins the livelihoods of tens of millions of smallholder producers on the ground. And I brought you today some images from my first field trip experience in Honduras, where this is around a decade ago, where I was able to meet with coffee farmers on the ground. And the question that they asked me most often, and that I've been also asked a lot by other producers, is why are we paid so little money to produce something that people in your country seem to value so highly? And this core question of value addition and value distribution and how to bring more value down to the farm level to support more sustainable livelihoods has been a key focus of my research so far. I was also struck when traveling around Honduras by the various types of production methods that farmers can use to grow this crop. So I would drive by landscapes like the one on the left, where whole hillsides were completely deforested in order to make space for new plants, and in preparation of a quite intensified way of producing coffee. But I also met with farmers that had planted their trees in this really diverse agroforestry system that was basically maintaining the biodiversity of a natural forest. And so here again, the question that comes to mind is how can we support farmers better to make choices like the one on the right rather than the one on the left, while still having a good and dignified livelihood. If we zoom out a little bit, this is the challenge of attaining sustainability in the global food system. And in the crops that I focus on, which are mainly tropical agri-commodities such as coffee, but also palm oil and cocoa, there's a number of challenges to this food system, including deforestation. Tropical commodities drive around 2/3 of tropical and subtropical deforestation, but also continued instances of forced and child labor, as well as this insistent issue of not being able to lift farmers out of poverty and provide them with living incomes that this system still hasn't been able to achieve. Now, when we talk about sustainability, as our students of sustainable development would know, and I see a couple here in the audience, we need to define our terms. And so while there's a number of different definitions, what I like to focus on is this goal of achieving well-being on an individual, communal, and societal level within planetary boundaries. So making sure to respect the boundaries of our planetary processes and not put too much pressure on them, while also making sure to provide the social foundations of housing, of health, of education, and other ways in which people can make a good life for themselves. I'm a political scientist by training, so when I look at sustainability, I then think about governance. How can we make, enforce, and implement rules that allow us to improve the sustainability of these global value chains? And how can we do so in a transnational fashion, a fashion that spans the boundaries that these global value chains also span? And in the course of my work, I've been able to look at a variety of waves of transnational governance in these global value chains. The first one being third-party certifications and multi-stakeholder roundtables. So here, the idea being that NGOs or conglomerates of stakeholders such as civil society organizations, but also businesses, decide what voluntary rules to create and then put into place market incentives to incentivize producers to adhere to these rules, right? So price premia, access to specialty markets, etc. We've also seen a second wave of transnational governance where companies internalize some of these standards more, and so create company codes of conduct that are very much focused on what the company needs, and it also might add quality criteria in addition to sustainability criteria. such as what Starbucks or Nespresso have done, for instance. And more recently, we've seen companies in the middle of the value chain, so trading companies that are moving product from one place to another, also creating their own sourcing standards and programs that they then sell onwards to their buyers as sustainability as a service and come into competition basically with third-party certification schemes. The latest wave, and the one that I'm also very keen on investigating, is that the state has come back in. So while the first 4 types have been basically private governance, so governance that is driven by non-state actors such as civil society organizations or firms, there has now been a movement for governments to take their responsibility more seriously and say, well, we need to make some of these voluntary rules mandatory. And so we can see that movement of governments becoming more involved, on the one hand, in the production space and in producing countries where, especially at the subnational level, there's more and more governments that come to collaborate with organizations and companies on the ground to try to define sustainable production systems and so-called jurisdictional approaches. But we can also see this on the consuming side, where more and more governments have recognized the limitations of voluntary private schemes and have said, we should actually harden the soft law. We need to make mandatory that companies have a greater accountability for the negative social and environmental impacts in their supply chains. I researched these types of approaches in a mixed methods fashion, combining qualitative research, especially via expert interviews of actors along the supply chain, and also experts in governments, in civil society organizations, or market observers, to understand how these schemes are really working in practice. What are the stumbling blocks? What are potential opportunities? And I then combine it with work that I do with many colleagues around the world to generate and analyze farm-level data so we can understand how farmers are being affected by these types of rules. And I also have a very interdisciplinary approach to my research, combining insights and theories from international political economy, global regulatory governance, business and society research that is coming more from the management space, and of course, sustainable agriculture. And so today what I want to do is illustrate some of the research that I did in the past in the more private governance arena, and talk about how this might tell us something about these new types of mandatory legislations and what we should look out for when researching them more. So I'll give you a brief overview of some of the research projects that have defined my career so far. So the first one was already mentioned by Professor Lengwiller. This was my dissertation work on the effectiveness of certification for coffee smallholders. This was done in Central America with fieldwork in Honduras, Colombia, and Costa Rica. I then switched to focusing more on these company internal codes of conduct, in focusing on zero deforestation commitments that companies in the palm oil sectors had been making. And these are commitments to eliminate deforestation from their supply chains. I also have been working on understanding these midstream actors, the trading companies, better in terms of what their role is and could be in terms of connecting the production to the consumption space and possibly acting as sustainability governance actors, but also having a lot of their own business interests that are in the mix. And finally, I've also, and this is one of the projects that I'm concluding now, been working on the implementation of climate mitigation and adaptation practices in the coffee value chain in East Africa, working with colleagues in Tanzania and Ethiopia. So all of this mainly on the private regulatory side. But what I'm now interested in moving to studying is this new wave of mandatory supply chain laws. And this movement started really by civil society action. So there was a number of NGOs, especially in Europe, that lobbied governments relentlessly to make these mandatory laws happen. And they were particularly successful in certain cases, such as in France with the Loi de Vigilance. Then this movement also spread to Germany. Actually, the Responsible Business Initiative, the Konzernverantwortungsinitiative here in Switzerland, was also part of this movement. And more, there were laws on the books that created harder accountability for effects of supply chains in foreign places, right? And so this was either making sure that businesses knew the impacts that they were having on the ground, or focusing on remediation, so making sure that businesses had to pay for damages caused to communities in foreign countries. This is mainly, but not exclusively, a European phenomenon. If we zoom out a little bit, we also see that in the Anglo-Saxon space, with specific focal topics, such as modern slavery or forced labor, we've also seen legislation coming on the books. And this has been, interestingly, moving from the UK to the US, Canada, and Australia. What we noticed, though, or what legislative actors and businesses noticed, was, especially in the European space, it was becoming particularly cumbersome to have more and more countries developing their own accountability and due diligence rules in a EU common market. So there needed to be a movement, so they argued, to lift these regulations into European space. And so now what we have just been faced with is that we have a number of, basically a portfolio of regulation at the EU level that focus on these various topics. So on the one hand, we have the EU deforestation regulation that was adopted in 2023, which prohibits the import of certain types of so-called forest risk commodities. So these are commodities that have historically been associated with deforestation. And this includes coffee, cocoa, palm oil, soy, cattle, rubber, and forest products. So these 7 commodities can only be imported into the EU market if companies can provide assurance that they were not produced on deforested land. What this means is that companies have to trace their supply chain all the way to the producing plots and then do deforestation risk assessment via satellite monitoring, for instance, to see whether there were land use changes in the past. We have a similar legislation that has just been adopted that focuses on forced labor, that bans the import of goods produced with forced labor. And we also have seen the adoption last year of the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. This is a more broad and process-based legislation that is based on the UN Guiding Principle for Business and Human Rights and focuses on businesses' duty to broadly map out what their potential human rights and environmental impacts might be, assess whether or not these impacts are actually happening on the ground, mitigate and stop any negative impacts that are happening, and remediate the possible damages caused, and for instance, via remuneration of affected communities. This particular directive still needs to be translated into national law and is also focused on the largest companies in Europe. The Swiss market is, of course, affected by this EU legislation in the sense that many companies are also trading and acting within the EU market, but we've also seen a number of laws coming on the books that are similar in the effect, and this was as a response to the Konzernverantwortungsinitiative. And so one of these are the due diligence provisions for child labor, and there's also another one on conflict minerals. So if we put our scientific hat on, this is actually a really interesting type of development because many steps are necessary in our theory of change to lead from these due diligence laws to impact on the ground. Because of course, European regulators can directly regulate manufacturers and retailers that are on the that are within their borders or that are also having their headquarters in their particular country. But these companies then still need to pass along these new requirements, such as don't deforest, don't use forced labor, to their suppliers. And they also may need to do all of this capacity building of making sure that there are no negative impacts happening. So this needs to be passed along through the entire supply chain. Many of these laws also implicitly rely on NGOs to do work in assessing impacts and basically having watchdog activities that might also need to support in terms of capacity building, and that might need to monitor whether or not companies are taking these responsibilities seriously. In addition, in the producing country, of course, there's also rules that producers need to comply with. And these rules ideally would need to be aligned with the expectations that regulators in Europe have. But we can also imagine that there's some rules that bounce up against the types of requirements that due diligence legislation is putting into place. So for instance, a particular contentious topic was whether or not companies would be allowed to export producer-level data out of the producing country in an effort to trace their value chains and pass along this data to other market actors. So all these actors need to work in unison to have the positive impacts that these laws are promising. And so what I'm interested in examining is how can regulators successfully bring about such sustainability transformations? And in particular, can they actually overcome some of the challenges that private governance faced when trying to achieve similar types of systemic changes? And what I want to talk about today, as mentioned, is what we can learn from past research, and I'll talk about my own research, and what we should look out for in the future. I want to make 3 suggestions. The first one is that we are likely to see decoupling between rules and practices. So the fact that the rules on the book do not actually reflect the practices on the ground. And we should put a lot of effort into understanding where this is happening and how this decoupling can be reduced in order to actually see effects on the ground. And I'll speak to each of these suggestions more. The second suggestion is that we'll need to focus a lot on how companies are able or willing to balance effectiveness and equity when implementing some of these laws. Because while in the case of, for instance, deforestation, these requirements might be effective in preventing deforestation from happening, they may be highly unjust and inequitable by allowing a lot of smallholder producers to no longer access markets. And the third suggestion that I have is that we should look at the credibility of commitments in terms of especially how these types of laws will be enforced to understand whether they provide signals and sufficient signals to companies to actually make all of these investments to comply in practice. So firstly, let's talk about decoupling. And here I draw on the work that I did during my PhD together with collaborators from the University of Münster and also Inkai Business School. So what we did here was we compared how farmers that were certified with a variety of certification schemes implemented sustainable social and environmental practices, and we compared this also to farmers that were not certified in order to see whether these certifications had an impact. And some of this work is summarized in my book. And what I want to draw on from this book is that it was really important to look at these different types of sustainable practices and think about what makes them different in order to understand why there was more or less decoupling. So in this graph, you see a variety of practices that producers were supposed to comply with, such as participating in trainings, doing record keeping, having higher soil cover, adopting diverse agroforestry methods. And the colors indicate whether or not there was differences, positive differences between certified farmers, so the more green there is, the greater the difference was, or if there was no difference in activity between certified and non-certified farmers, and this would be in orange. And so what we can see here is that it is much less likely for farmers in this particular sample to actually comply and have these large-scale effects if the particular practice had a high opportunity cost. So the types of practices that had win-win situations in terms of an economic outcome where there was a cost saving because they were using less pesticides for the same yield, or they were getting trainings for higher productivity, these were practices that they adopted quite frequently. But if there were either high one-time payments or even worse, continuous costs, for instance, by paying higher than average wages across the board, or taking up practices that really reduced yields, we saw fewer changes. And so we argue that this was because, as rational farmers, they didn't see the benefit of trading off their economic sustainability, even if these types of practices that had these highest opportunity costs would have really great social and environmental benefits. In another paper, we looked at how to reduce this decoupling, so this gap between what the rules said on the book and what the producers did in practice. And we drew on organizational theory, which has argued that decoupling is actually a phenomenon that is very, very common in organizations, especially those where efficiency objectives of the organization, we need to do as much as possible at the lowest cost possible, actually come into tension with these rules that are put into place that restrict them. And so some of the hypotheses that we tested were, if we give sufficient financial compensation, for instance, via price premiums, does that improve the practices? Is it better to have more stringent and more specific rules? Because maybe it's the leeway that is in the rule book that is being exploited here. Is it about knowing the rules properly? Can we prevent decoupling from happening with building greater capacity, so that sort of the barrier here was not being able to implement the rules? Or do we need more monitoring via auditing and via sort of good auditing practices? And when looking at this in this sample of Honduran farmers, what we found was that it was really the financial compensation, the rule knowledge, and the auditing presence that were driving a lot of the differences between some farmers who were complying with the rules very well and others who weren't. And in the dissertation more broadly, I make the point that we really need to focus on compensation for these types of additional beneficial practices and finding ways to make some of these market-based systems provide a higher price down to the farmer in order to make sure that they implement these practices. Now, turning towards the mandatory legislation, of course here, who is regulated is the company rather than the producer at the end. But at the same time, it is likely that we're going to see similar types of decoupling happening, especially in companies that are even more profit-oriented and possibly even more rationalized than smallholder farmers that may also have other types of motivations for their behavior. And indeed, when talking to some companies in the coffee sector on how they were preparing for this EU deforestation regulation, the one that is pushing them to trace all of their supply chains down to the plot level, which is a very high cost for them, I was told by a number of people that people will find ways to cut corners and comply without actually complying, and that the way that this regulation is set up, that will be very easy to do, which is quite unfortunate, and that basically they were expecting a lot of cheating to happen. Of course, they then also said, we would never cheat, but many others are likely to do it. And so here again, I think it'll be very interesting to study how these rules are going to be implemented in practice, what kind of loopholes are being exploited and how to close those loopholes, and what other measures to put into place, especially in terms of enforcement, to make sure that we're seeing possible impacts on the ground. Secondly, we want to focus our attention on the balancing of effectiveness and equity. And this draws a lot on the work that I did at ETH Zurich, together with a team of researchers, including Rachel Garrett and Adelina Chandra and Mathieu. Adelina and Mathieu are here today, who where we looked at these zero deforestation commitments. So these commitments that companies made: by 2020, we will have no more deforestation in our value chains. And we were looking here at what do they actually do in order to make this commitment happen, and how does that affect smallholder producers, especially on the ground here in Sumatra and Indonesia. And we were very concerned that there would be smallholder exclusion that could happen. When talking again to companies that had been faced with implementing these commitments, they would tell me that usually they followed a series of steps. So first, they would create the supplier code of conduct. They would then focus on creating traceability down to the farm level in order to understand where they're mainly sourcing from. They then implemented these monitoring systems using geospatial information to look at, are there any cases of deforestation that are happening at the moment? And in cases where there was deforestation, the idea was we will engage with our suppliers, we will talk to them, ask them, please stop deforesting, otherwise you'll be kicked out of our value chain. And if the supplier did not stop, they would indeed sever ties and basically use this disincentive of losing out on their market as a motivation for their suppliers to become deforestation-free. But what people also told me is that this is the ideal case, but we're actually facing a lot of difficulties, a lot of tensions between different types of objectives. On the one hand, there's these tensions in terms of what goal we should be pursuing. And so here in this particular paper, we use the language of paradoxes, which is a term that comes more from the management literature on enduring tensions that companies have to tackle. And of course, initially, one of the main focal goals of these companies was environmental sustainability. So making sure to fulfill these commitments because they had been attacked relentlessly by civil society campaigners that were accusing them of causing habitat loss and basically killing all of the orangutans by not allowing them enough habitat to live. So there was a strong motivation to improve their environmental sustainability, in particular by having this full supply chain traceability and also accountability for deforestation in their supply chains by being quite strict on engaging or cutting off suppliers. But they also told me, well, we have this goal of smallholder inclusion, and some of our license to operate is also that we are actually generating some sort of community development because we're sourcing both from plantation and from a lot of smallholders surrounding those plantations. But implementing these types of policies in our smallholder base is incrementally more difficult and more expensive because you have to trace hundreds of thousands of farmers. They also are shifting in and out of our supply chains. We have to be keeping all of these systems up to date, and we also would have to roll out all of these capacity building programs. So in the mind of the company, at the very least, they're saying, this is going to be extremely costly, and I was told by an executive, well, you can have zero deforestation or you can have smallholder inclusion, but if you want both, you have to put a lot of money on the table. It's going to cost you. But then there's also this economic sustainability goal that companies had and continue to have, where they said, is it really worthwhile? Can we actually put so much effort and so much of our budgets into this, especially if it's not really clear whether or not this will affect our bottom line in a positive way? In addition, and in a sense to make matters worse, there was also what we called organizing paradoxes happening of should we pursue these goals, even once we are able to define what the goal actually is. Because one could think of a way to resolve some of those tensions on the performing side by saying, let's collaborate with other people. Obviously, each of us tracing all of our value chains is super inefficient, especially if many companies are doing this in the same supply basis. So why not work together, share our data, share our information, also co-invest in monitoring systems? This is going to be so much better. But then they also said, well, we made these commitments in order to be competitive compared to our other competitors. If we're the first one to achieve a zero deforestation value chain, we'll be the one that will be able to sell on, become a trusted supplier and sell on to our buyers. So we actually don't want to collaborate that much. And so there were all of these tensions that appeared and that were basically many times freezing companies in their decision-making process. On the more normative side, with our colleagues, I worked on deciding or putting together some recommendations on what companies should ideally do in order to find synergies between effectiveness and equity. This effectiveness in moving towards lower deforestation and the equity in making sure that there's smallholder inclusion. And so what we argued in 2 papers, and one of these is led by Adelina, is that companies should focus on making sure to bring smallholder producers into the decision-making process already by assuring procedural equity so that they are being consulted and their opinions are being heard when designing these policies and also implementation modalities, that policies and programs should be adjusted to take their concerns seriously, and then make sure that companies actually provide this type of help to their suppliers, to the smallholder suppliers, by providing them with trainings on what to do, maybe also lowering barriers that might be hard to achieve, for instance, in terms of land titles. And this would then create equity and access, making sure that any type of producer is able to access these potentially higher value supply chains, and also that there's then equity and outcomes in terms of not just plantations, but also smallholder farmers being able to benefit from selling to European markets. And so this would then allow for better livelihood impacts, but also for forest conservation. But when we looked at what was happening in practice in these Sumatran supply chains, what we found was that companies were very often prioritizing this smallholder inclusion or equity goal above the effectiveness goal. And what that basically meant was that they were completely ignoring the smallholder supply sheds when implementing their policies. So this graph shows us areas where smallholder producers live, where companies that had very strong zero deforestation commitments were sourcing from. Those are in yellow. The areas where companies were sourcing from that had so-so commitments that are in green, and areas where there was no companies were sourcing from them that had zero deforestation commitments in purple. And so we wanted to look at, on the ground, what are the differences that people are noticing in terms of what the rules are. And first of all, we found that very few people even had heard of these types of rules, that the company was wanting to limit deforestation, or that they would not be able to sell to them if they had deforested. 7% of the people in the supply chains of companies with very high commitments knew about this in the first place. And so what we then see is that also, not just do the producers not know, but even the people that are the contact points to the producers, so the intermediaries, the traders, many of them also were not aware that these policies existed. And if there was training that was happening, which to some extent it was focused mainly on either good agricultural practices or certification. So we're going back to this private certification standard, but the certification was very much focused on cooperatives that were able to access this. And so many smallholder farmers that were not organized in cooperatives were basically not being targeted at all, meaning that there was very little efforts to prevent deforestation in these supply chains. Now, the new mandatory regulation is coming in, and here companies, at least on paper, should be unable to shirk in this way by saying, we'll just not implement this in our smallholder supply bases, because they have to implement this no matter what their supplier status is. And so what we are hearing that is likely to happen is that instead they will prioritize the effectiveness above the equity, and at least in the short term, lower the numbers and the types of smallholder producers that they're buying from. And so this is again from the coffee sector, a trading representative explaining to me that if there's additional rules that are coming and that they have to implement, and they have to buy 100,000 bags of coffee, they could either source this from one Brazilian producer that has a huge plantation, that has a PhD, that has a private plane, that is like very plugged into this regulatory environment, or they could go to 100,000 farmers in Rwanda that are each producing one bag and trace them and get all of these people to understand the rules. And so here they're also saying, what am I going to do if I'm efficient? At least initially, I'm going to source from the larger plantations first. And so if there's no rules around preventing these types of unintended consequences from happening, this is a really high concern when thinking about what these regulations are doing in practice. Now, the third thing that I want to highlight is that we should think about the credibility of commitments when thinking about how forward-looking policy changes is changing the expectations of producers. And let me explain this. So this is work that I did focused initially also on company commitments. So companies that have made, again, commitments to no deforestation, but also there was other commitments that they would only buy certified products, for instance, or more we're seeing companies that are making commitments to net zero supply chains. And what all of these have in common is that it's a company putting a stake in the ground and saying, by this target date, we will no longer do this particular thing or buy this particular thing, right? And so here the theory of change, at least in theory, is that this company commitment creates a very strong demand signal. So they're saying, we will demand only this. If you don't supply this, you will be cut off from us. That this demand signal then leads to a supply adjustment. Producers say, oh no, I won't be able to sell to Walmart anymore. Let me change my practices. This then leads to sufficient changes in the products that the company is sourcing that by the time of the target date, it can say, well, I changed all of my buying, and we have reduced environmental or social impacts. However, many times this theory of change breaks down, because what oftentimes happens is that a company makes a commitment, but it only creates a weak demand signal. People don't actually know about it, or they're unsure whether they're going to go through with it, or it's too demanding, or there's sufficient other buyers out there. And so at the target date, there's insufficient supply for them to meet their commitment. But of course, they're not going to cut down and only supply half of the possible demand to their own clients. So what then happens is changes in commitment in terms of pushing the target date back, changing the requirements that are necessary. So Walmart in this case said, well, if you're on the road to certification and you've sort of like made this particular pledge that you're willing to transform, we will count that as well. Or more often than not, commitments are dropped from company websites because that was the last CEO that did it anyway, and the situation now is different. And so we have continued environmental or social impacts that continue to happen. And in this paper, I looked into credible commitment theory that comes a lot from international relations and game theoretical approaches, and was very popular during the Cold War times, because people were thinking about what kind of commitment can the US or the Soviet Union make that they will really send their nuclear arms and therefore create this mutually assured destruction. So it's very fun to have a little bit of a detour into thinking at that time. But what I came out with was these interesting insights that there's basically two types of credibility that you can use in order to have, in order to convince your opponent or your supplier or whoever that you'll really do what you said that you would do. And the first one is motivational credibility. This means that the other person thinks that you will still implement what you said that you would do because you're still motivated to do it. And you could get there by saying, well, the commitment is very feasible. I have always done what I said I would do, so why would it be different now? So drawing on historical precedents. linking this commitment very strongly to your reputation, showing that you have very good enforcement ability, or also changing payoff structures in a way where it would actually hurt you to not implement your commitment. But many times we have these commitments that are kind of veiled threats and that really work on the hope that the other actor will do what you would want to do. And so then if they don't do it, it's kind of hurting you. You're shooting yourself in the foot if you're doing it also. And so what you need then is this imperative credibility. That is, there's no other option for you than to do what you said that you would do because you bound your hands in the past. And so here the metaphor is Ulysses that has to sail through a sea of sirens that sing so beautifully that all the sailors jump overboard. And so he binds himself to the mast and puts wax in his ears in order to not be tempted, right? And here, what we can do as a company, for instance, is to limit loopholes or using contracts or other agents to basically outsource the decision on whether or not you would fulfill your commitments. And this, if this is credibly signaled and communicated, would also make people believe you more. And I looked at a variety of commitments in the space of supply chains, so in palm oil and seafood and also horticulture, and found that generally the credibility of these commitments is quite low, both on the motivational, but especially on the imperative side. But I found this really interesting exception, which was a program called the Fair Food Program run by the Coalition of Immokalee Workers in Florida. And these were tomato farmers that challenged companies in the area, such as fast food companies that were buying these tomatoes, to say, you should only source from companies that have fair labor practices. But not only did they challenge them to make that commitment, but they also signed a binding agreement, a legally binding agreement with this particular NGO. And so this was then a form of imperative credibility, right? Because they outsourced the possibility of defecting because it could be challenged in court if they didn't do what they had agreed on with this NGO. And also they outsourced the enforcement action. So there was an additional independent body that was monitoring what was happening in these farms. And so they actually showed a lot of improvements on the ground at much faster pace than in other situations. Now, turning back to the mandatory legislation, I would argue that there's a similar kind of tendency happening, especially with regulations that create this grace period for companies to move into compliance. So a lot of these due diligence laws say, as of 2027 or as of 2026, we will enforce this, so we're giving you a lot of time to get ready. But you have to move now, right? And so here, the theory of change is there's all of this expectation that there will be very stringent enforcement that then leads companies to move, to invest, to interact, to cooperate, and we would have these positive impacts on the ground. But of course, there's also the possibility that there's pushback happening from the side of the regulated actors, the companies, and that they say, wait a second. You're saying that you will enforce this, but this is completely impossible to achieve, and you also don't have the enforcement capability of doing so. What are these laws that you're trying to impose on us? You don't even understand how our supply chains works. This is unworkable. And if this type of expectation gains traction, then many more companies will do very little or nothing at all in order to get ready. And so then at the time point when the regulators should start enforcing, they would be facing this dilemma. Do we punish everybody? Do we then basically draw down our competitiveness? And so what then happens a lot, and this is already happening now in practice, is that there's, again, this delaying action happening, right? And so we see this in the context of the EU deforestation law, whose implementation and enforcement has just been pushed back a year. We also see that there's already pushbacks on this corporate sustainability due diligence directive, where a lot of companies have been arguing that all of this red tape in this current geopolitical environment is limiting our competitiveness too much, and so this is being opened up again. And what we want to look at as a research group over the next couple of years is to dig a little bit more into this political economy of expectations. How do the expectations and other elements of policy making impact what is happening in the development phase, in the implementation phase, and ultimately what kind of compliance will actually be enforced. And so I was lucky enough to receive a starting grant to be able to dig into this for the next 5 years with a group of researchers, 2 postdocs and 2 PhD students that we just hired, which is very exciting, as well as a number of colleagues that will work with us on these topics. And so we will do this through a triple comparative analysis, looking at these 3 issue areas that I've talked about a bit now: deforestation, forced and child labor, and poverty and living incomes. We will also look at how these due diligence laws, so the deforestation regulation, the CSDDD, also the Swiss child labor due diligence obligations, are affecting supply chains in 3 crops, so in coffee, cocoa, and palm oil, that are quite similar in some aspects but different in others. And we will look at how they affect producers and communities in 2 producing countries in Colombia and Cote d'Ivoire that produce all 3 crops. So we can also see to what extent company-level action and differences in how sectors are being treated might make a difference. But of course, this is not the only thing that is being done at our sustainability research group. So I also had the pleasure of coming into a group that had already and is continuing to do a lot of great work, especially in the area of energy transitions and sustainable mobility. And so what we will want to do is to create a research group that has these 2 pillars. On the one hand, agricultural and food system, sustainability, and on the other hand, energy and mobility systems, alongside sort of the nexus, which is biofuels, and do this from a transnational to local level, and from the production to the consumption side, and look at sustainability transformations in these spaces. And hopefully over time, this graph will continue to be populated. So one of the really great joys of doing this research is to having had the opportunity to meet many, many amazing researchers, colleagues, collaborators, that it's been an absolute fantastic experience to work with. And I don't know if this is the same in other fields, but the field of sustainability governance just has many, many impressive individuals. So, and I've had the benefit of meeting a lot of them and working with them. So I want to thank my mentors, my collaborators and colleagues in the different places that I've worked. Also, my friends and family that have always supported me on this path, and I look forward to connecting more with all of you and possibly also collaborating on some of these topics. Thank you so much.